The anime starts off with the protagonist riding a motorcycle as fast as he can, and he has the philosophical thought that people who bend over to the rules are the real cowards. He then asks himself about the kind of life he's living. Is he a coward? He then goes to the house where he's living and decides to watch some TV. On the TV, he watches how Yukiko Shirato announces the Megalobox Championship, the one and only Megalomania. What makes Megalomania different from the rest of the Megalobox Championship is that literally any citizen can enter. Of course, he'd have to go through some series of elimination battles before he can be a part of the Megalomania. But if anyone is feeling up to the challenge, there aren't many restrictions in taking this one on. Another person in the house advises Joe to take part in the Megalomania, but he simply can't do it because he doesn't even have a citizen ID card. Even though he's a good megaloboxer, he has no choice but to continue making his wage from underground fights, because the world will never accept him no matter how skilled he gets. Inside, Joe has a developing turmoil because of this. He then goes to get back his fixed gear from the shop. The gear is the one thing that sets apart normal boxing from megaloboxing. Megaloboxers wear a gear around their arms, which enhances their punching speed and power. Depending on the model they're wearing, the fight can also become a death sentence to both the user of the gear and the person on the receiving end of those punches. The guy who had fixed Joe's gear tells him that he did make a lot of money betting on him from the last fight. The shopkeeper is convinced that Joe has some serious skill. In fact, according to him, all the pros out there in Megalomania are probably not that different from Joe. Joe then tells him to make sure to bet on him for tonight's fight. He then reaches the fight venue where two random dudes tell him to lose the fight and try to make the loss convincing. This sends him over the top and he goes to confront his coach, Nanbu. The coach tells him that rigging gambling is the easiest way to make money in the underground world. He then tells him that it's better to lose the fight since Joe is so good that when he beats all the opponents over here, they go down in the first round. The crowd really doesn't love that at all. They want to see a long, hard-fought brawl. This is another reason Nanbu is trying to convince him to throw the fight. No matter how much throwing fights pisses Joe off, in the end, he must comply. The fight starts, and it goes just as Nanbu had instructed him. He eventually takes a punch in a way that convinces the crowd that he has actually lost. Nanbu gets his share of the money at the bar, and so will Joe, but he is too riled up emotionally to even care about money after suffering a defeat that could have been a victory. He drives his motorcycle off as far as he can without any direction late into the night. After driving for a while, he nearly crashes into a woman, but manages to save her at the cost of his own crash. The woman immediately comes to his aid, and he reacts like a jerk, asking her if she has a death wish. To his surprise, the woman is Yukiko Shirato herself. She is the one who organizes the Megalomania event. She tells Joe this road is not supposed to be open to begin with, so she wasn't expecting any driver to come racing here. However, she still gives him her card, saying that if he contacts this number, he'll be given the proper reimbursement for the crash. Despite the cooperative nature of the lady, Joe still acts like a jerk to her. Her bodyguard, Yuri, is right there for her. However, he's not just any ordinary bodyguard. He's the champion of Megalomania. He doesn't like Joe's attitude at all and takes his boxing stance. Joe reciprocates his thirst for battle, saying that he's in such a mood that he'll even take the champion on. After they take their boxing stance, Joe feels the excitement in the air of standing against a champion. It almost felt like time had stopped for him to relish the thrill of that moment alone. However, Shirato tells Yuri to stand down, and he must back down from the fight. Joe still hurls some insults straight at Yuri as he leaves, along with Shirato. The next day, Joe has another fight. His opponent doesn't show up, but to everyone's surprise, Yuri shows up in the underground ring, announcing that he has unfinished business with the stray dog Joe. The next episode starts with both Yuri and Joe on the opposite end of the ring ready to face each other in a brawl. Yuri's pride would never have allowed Joe's insult to go unpunished, and his eyes held a fury inside of them waiting to be unleashed. Nanbu makes every effort to stop the fight because his partner Joe is just an average underground boxer, and Yuri is the champ. He's wearing an integrated gear that obviously packs a lot more punch than whatever scrap metal excuse for a gear Joe is wearing. There is literally no chance that he can win. But when the bell rings, Joe charges in with all his fury, aiming to knock Yuri to the ground. Naturally, all his blows were easily dodged by Yuri. It was obvious that he was pretty much just toying with him at this point. Then, after a few seconds, Yuri counters with a left jab that slides across Joe's face. It hadn't connected enough to cause a knockout, but it sent shivers down Joe's spine. He felt a realization that if something like this makes a perfect connection with his face, it's pretty much all over for him. However, Despite the momentary terror that took over Joe, it soon turns into excitement as he realizes that he's against the very best of the best. This is a chance that very few underground dogs could ever get. Yuri, on the other hand, became even more confident in his abilities and lets down his right arm. He says that taking on a stray dog like Joe will be pretty easy for him and that he doesn't require his right arm to be wasting energy. Joe takes the charge once more and even manages to deflect Yuri's left hand, giving him an opening to strike. Sadly, he can't capitalize on it and ends up taking a killer left jab from Yuri instead. He's down bad just from taking one of Yuri's weakest punches. As the countdown starts, he tries his best to regain his consciousness and eventually ends up standing again despite being nearly knocked out cold. What bugs Joe most and hurts his pride is the fact that Yuri is relying on his left hand only. He has a growing turmoil inside him that wants to take Yuri off his high horse. He charges back at him, this time setting an intelligent trap that would catch Yuri off guard, and it nearly does. Yuri ends up relying on his right hand to block a punch, or it would have been lights out for him. Joe tells him to drop the show-off act and fight him for real. Yuri is impressed with what this stray dog had to offer in terms of raw fight potential. He then takes up his right hand and tells him that his wish is going to be granted. They continue to fight, and it doesn't take long before Yuri lands a clean right hook straight at Joe's face. The countdown begins, and Yuri steps out of the ring saying that Joe can't possibly get up in time with a punch that powerful straight to his chin. He begins to leave the stadium and Joe shouts at him from the back. He didn't get up in time, but how he got up after a punch that lethal was alone a testament to his sheer will. He tries to rile Yuri up even more by saying that his boxing isn't even that impressive. It can't even kill a stray dog like himself. Joe expresses his desire to continue the fight. However, Yuri says that if he really wants to share the ring with him, he should climb his way up to Megalomania, where he'll be waiting for him at the top. Saying that, he leaves the stadium. Joe goes on yet another bike trip and drives it as fast as he can to blow off some steam. He nearly drives off a cliff, but his excitement level is through the roof. He begins shadow boxing, and the next day asks Nanbu that he wishes to join Megalomania. Nanbu, being a realistic fella, hits Joe with punches of cold, hard facts. Firstly, Joe is not even a citizen, and there is no way he'll ever reach the top 4 of Megalomania in the next 3 months. The top 4 are the only ones who get to be in the Megalomania. The rest are eliminated. Nanbu tells Joe that he has fixed another fight for him to throw. When the fight night arrives, Joe doesn't throw the fight. Instead, he walks straight to the fighter's end with both of his hands down and lands a clean right cross that knocks his opponent out cold. He openly states that he's done throwing fights. Nanbu is left having no choice but to apologize to Fujimaki, who rigs the gambling and relies on Joe to throw his fights. Nanbu tries his best to convince him that Joe will listen and be obedient from now on. However, Fujimaki has other plans. He tells him that now Joe should join Megalomania as he has a shot at making it big time. In return, Fujimaki will get a share of whatever he earns. The next episode starts off with Nanbu going to the International Megalomania Association to register Joe so he can start climbing his way into the Megalomania. However, there is one small problem. There are people who know him there from long ago. Nanbu had turned into a kind of person he doesn't take pride in. He tries his best to hide himself and avoid those folks from the old days, but eventually, he gets caught by one of them. He tells Nanbu that he's aware of him running underground shows. Nanbu replies that it was good business, but he came across a live wire of a kid whom he now wants to register with the IMA. Nanbu tells them that this kid has got the potential to make it to Megalomania. After a small chat with them, Nanbu goes ahead and tries to register Joe with a fake citizen ID given to him by Fujimaki. To his surprise, it worked, and he goes back to Fujimaki to have a drink with him. Nanbu tells him the good news, and Fujimaki tells him that it's now up to Joe to make sure he keeps winning. Fujimaki reminds him that Joe doesn't really have to win the Megalomania event. Making it there is well enough to set the plan he has in mind into motion. Their conversation eventually ends, and Nanbu catches up with Joe, who has his eyes set on Yuri. Nanbu reminds him that Joe is no big shot. In fact, Joe is the last-ranking megalo boxer of the International Megalo Boxing Association, and the only thing he should be worried about is getting into Megalomania to begin with. Joe asks Nanbu what exactly his game plan is. He tells him that the first thing that needs to be done is improving his gear. With the scrap metal piece of junk he's been using underground, Joe would stand no chance against his opponents. They then head out to get the upgrades. On their way, Nanbu starts talking about Yuri's gear. It's the latest integrated model that blends with his arms entirely. Its speed and power are unmatched with anything that's out there right now. Joe questions why they can't buy that kind of gear for themselves, which rubs Nanbu the wrong way. He counters by saying there is no way something like that would even be available commercially by the company that wants him to win the championship. To top it off, that gear places a great deal of strain on the body. Yuri was obviously born some kind of genetic freak to begin with, since he can handle the strain that gear makes. The scene cuts to a few children, and one of them is Sachio. The kids devise a plan to steal the camera of a man selling them. One of them distracts the man while Sachio sends a remote-controlled mouse inside the shelf, containing all the cameras. This makes the shopkeeper freak out, giving the kids the opportunity they needed to steal a few cameras before running off from the place. The kids go to a shopkeeper who'd be willing to buy them, and it's the same place where Joe and Nanbu are to upgrade their gear. The shopkeeper gives those kids some red candy in exchange for their cameras. However, there is one red candy short, and Sachio doesn't get any. He gets angry and attacks the owner. Before things could escalate any further, Joe steps in and stops the fight. Joe and Nanbu head out of there in their truck, and Nanbu tells him to not get involved in people's affairs. He replies that the shopkeeper was about to get too aggressive against a mere kid. Even though he wasn't a cute kid, he still didn't deserve anything bad happening to him at such a young age. They make a beat-up gym by a random river and begin to train there. Nanbu tells Joe that there is something he wants to show him. He then exposes how Joe's weakness lies in his reckless aggression, which leaves him wide open to an attack most of the time. He has a bad habit of dropping his guard when it matters most. They spar for a while trying to work on this bad habit of Joe. Meanwhile, Sachio also observes Joe from a distance and does a little bit of research on him. He realizes that Joe is the last-ranked fighter in the International Megalomania Association. From that moment on, Sachio begins to keep an eye on Joe nearly every day and observe his training. One day, Nanbu finally prepares the final version of their gear and lets Joe use it for a bit. Joe is impressed, as it has lots of power. However, the kid comes out of hiding and points out the obvious flaw in it. Firstly, a lot of power doesn't make up for a lack of speed, and the gear would obviously have a hard time lasting a lot of rounds if something like this is producing that much power. Nanbu thinks the kid knows a thing or two about gears, but they don't have a choice, and they've made their game plan keeping in mind the gear's flaws. Sachio then asks to come to Megalomania with them, but Joe refuses and says that he'd be just dead weight to them. The next day, the worst thing happens. Nanbu was trying to make some modifications to the gear, and it ended up blowing up in flames. Sachio counters by saying that gear was Sachio's to begin with, and he made a big mistake by trading it for a very low amount. Eventually, Joe comes to the rescue and crashes into the shop with his bike. He takes on the shopkeeper's bodyguard without any gear and manages to win. Sachio is then set to sail with Joe to Megalomania. The next episode starts with Joe being introduced as Gearless Joe in his debut match against Samejima the Shark. That's right. Since their gear burned out, Nanbu thought it was best to have Joe fight without a gear instead of finding a bad one at the last second. He discusses with the team beforehand that if Joe fought without a gear, he'd attract a lot of attention. And in combat sports, attention is currency. This will allow them to get potential sponsors and even help them set bouts against higher-ranking opponents much more easily. When the crowd was introduced to Gearless Joe, they did not take it well at all. The first thing that crossed their mind was that Joe was a complete idiot to think that he could take on an opponent with a fully functioning gear. The referee took the attention of the whole crowd and clarified that there were no rules in Megalomania forcing people to use a gear to fight Megalo box matches. If a person wishes to, he can simply not wear one, but at his own risk. The match proceeds as planned, and Samejima is visibly pissed seeing that his opponent is not wearing gear. He looks Joe in the eye and tells him that Joe will be annihilated, to which Joe simply replies to give it his best shot. The bell rings and the match begins. Joe quickly takes control of the rhythm, showing it to everyone how despite being gearless, he's still a force to be reckoned with. He even manages to land a couple of good punches, but then the power of the opponent's gear takes over the match. Even though Joe was fast enough to block one of his opponent's punches, the impact was still strong enough to knock him to the ground. The countdown starts, and despite having blocked it successfully, he was riled up enough to have a hard time getting up. With sheer grit alone, he still manages to get up just before the countdown ends. Before the match could continue, the bell rings, and Joe is saved by the bell. The next round starts, and things begin to heat up even more. Joe begins to play more passively. He completely lost his aggression, and could not even counter properly. Samejima made a foul move to finish off Joe, but the referee took note and stopped it, saving Joe from a humiliating knockout. The bell rings, and the second round also ends. Nanbu realizes that for the first time Joe is afraid. The sheer difference in power had sent shivers down his spine, and it was preventing him from moving the way he usually would. Nanbu puts his hands on Joe's shoulder and tells him that fear is an instinct that he's going to have to accept and defeat. Going into the third round, Joe comes in with a complete change in attitude. He becomes more relaxed, and his movements become much more fluid. He eventually lands a perfect right cross that cements his victory over the shark. The crowd is taken aback by what they have just witnessed. For the first time in the history of megalo boxing, a gearless boxer has won a match. The confidence he gains after winning the first fight is what gives him the edge he needed as Gearless Joe. He goes on to win the next few fights quite easily. After going on a streak of victory, Nanbu gets a challenge from the 17th ranked boxer, and he's delighted to have the offer as it would set them closer than ever to entering the Megalomania. The fighter also meets with Nanbu to greet him when Nanbu takes his first look at the fighter. He gets shocked, almost as if he had seen a ghost. The 17th ranked fighter happened to be a long-lost student of Nanbu, and his name was Aragaki. They both sat down outside where they could have a heart-to-heart conversation. Nanbu was surprised that Aragaki had made it out of the war alive. He thought he'd never see Aragaki again. They reminisce about the past and have a heart-to-heart conversation. Aragaki believes that the megalo boxing taught to him by Nanbu was what saved him after the war. He lost so much in the war and went on about how he still thinks highly of Nanbu and wishes to repay him. Nanbu replies that there is no need. The fact that Aragaki is fighting Joe is repayment enough. As soon as Nanbu mentions Joe, Aragaki's tone suddenly changes. He gets up and begins to leave. As he leaves, he utters the words, "Your fighter Joe. I've decided to destroy him." These words took Nanbu by absolute surprise. He realizes in that moment for the very first time that Aragaki took the fight not to help Joe, but to destroy him. It didn't make sense to him entirely at this point, but Nanbu knew that something was off about Aragaki. Aragaki then leaves him, and the last thing he says is, "It's time for you to pay the debt of things I've lost." Nanbu heads straight back to Joe, and says that he's thinking of exploring another fight. A path to megalomania that doesn't involve a brawl with Aragaki is something that would make him happy. Joe, being the fierce and hot-blooded boxer that he is, completely objects to this idea. It doesn't matter who he's against. Joe will take that fight if it means he will get closer to megalomania. Sachio also pulls up more information from the web about Aragaki. They find out that both of his legs were lost to the war and he fights with prosthetic legs. Seeing his condition, Nanbu now understood what Aragaki meant when he said, "It's time for you to pay the debt of things I've lost." This fuels his desire to prevent the fight even more, but Joe is quite stubborn no matter how much Nanbu tries to talk him out of the fight. Eventually, Nanbu must yield to Joe and agrees to take the fight. They immediately begin to prepare for the fight. Nanbu says that there is no fine strategy that can be cooked up against Aragaki. The only way to win is to polish the skills he already has and count on them. Joe takes a little looking into Aragaki and his history with Sachio. He discovers that he's quite the brutal warrior. Nearly all the opponents he's ever faced ended up straight in the hospital. He really is someone suffering from severe PTSD and taking it out on everyone in his way. Meanwhile, Nanbu heads to Veteran Affairs to meet up with Aragaki one more time in hopes of convincing him not to destroy Joe out of hatred. However, the only person he could encounter is Aragaki's new trainer, Miyagi. The trainer tells Nanbu that Aragaki doesn't want to meet with him. Nanbu has been a horrible teacher because he did not think of searching for Aragaki when he came back from the war. When Aragaki came back to his old life here, he did nothing but search for Nanbu. Yet he was nowhere to be found. Nanbu counters by saying that he was wrongfully informed that Aragaki had been killed in action. According to the trainer, that's not a reasonable excuse. He believes that Nanbu should have done his best to search and confirm Aragaki's death. In the end, Nanbu tells the trainer to convey a message to Aragaki. If Aragaki wishes to hate him, then so be it. But he shouldn't take it out on Joe at all. The trainer then goes and has a little talk with Aragaki. He tells Aragaki that this fight is pointless. He's only taking out his own frustration of being replaced by Joe. According to the trainer, Aragaki was acting like a dog who was upset at being replaced by his master. Aragaki didn't accept it and says that this is the fight to make if they want attention and sponsors. He then continues to do his leg workout. After a while, Aragaki comes across Joe during his cardio session. Joe has a little talk with him about how there is no point in blaming Nanbu for everything that's happened to Aragaki. Aragaki doesn't seem to care about explaining anything or having a conversation with Joe. In the end, Joe says that Aragaki can try his best to destroy him if he wishes. However, Aragaki shouldn't expect it to be easy, and their conversation ends there. Eventually, the fight night arrives, and after exchanging a few punches with Aragaki, Joe takes a fatal blow, and the countdown starts. This fight wasn't going to be easy. Joe manages to get up from the countdown. He's ready, on his feet with his hands up, determined to win the fight. However, after exchanging a few more punches, Joe begins to rely on clinching to keep himself from getting knocked out repeatedly. The crowd doesn't like it and immediately starts booing after a few clinches from Joe. Most of them begin to shout out that Gearless should fight like a man and not like a coward. However, Nanbu tells him to keep relying on those clinches if it ensures his survival in the ring. Nanbu is quite insightful and has already taken a good read at the threat Joe is facing. Aragaki has obviously improved a lot, and as if that wasn't bad enough already. He has a very thick edge over Joe in terms of speed and technique. However, he is lacking in power. That's a weakness that's very hard to exploit, since someone like Aragaki can easily capitalize on the shortest of windows. When the round ends, Nanbu reminds Joe that it is the duty of a coach to ensure that his fighter gets back home safe after going in the ring. He reminds Joe that it's completely fine if they forfeit the fight over here. They can still continue their journey and find someone new to fight. Joe disagrees. He reminds Nanbu that he doesn't care about who he's fighting. He'll win against anyone, no matter what. Saying that, he steps into the ring, ready for round 2. In the next round, Joe begins to use the footwork taught to him by Nanbu. He tells himself the words, "Split the weight evenly." Aimbada Aragaki hears those words coming out of Joe's mouth. They rub him the wrong way and he loses a bit of his cool. Aragaki shouts at Joe, telling him that training will be useless against a boxer like Aragaki. The second round ends, and in the entire round, Joe was on the defensive. He dodged some hits, whereas others he had to block. He countered some of his attacks, but none were successful. When the second round ends, Nanbu again tries to convince Joe that it's best to end the fight. The only thing Aragaki wants is to see Nanbu watch Joe getting beaten. However, Joe disagrees. Yes, there is a part of him that hates Nanbu, but that's not entirely why he took the fight. Joe senses that his punches are not loosened with sheer resentment. Instead, they come from a mixture of emotions that not even Aragaki understands just yet. Perhaps this uncertainty is why he took this fight to begin with. The next round starts, and Joe is again on the defensive. He keeps taking punches as long as he can, and then suddenly, he strikes back out of nowhere. He lands a perfect right cross that sends Aragaki's face straight to the floor. This takes the whole crowd by surprise. Aragaki gets back up and starts fighting. The round eventually ends. Miyagi tells Aragaki that it was just a lucky punch, but Aragaki disagrees. He says that this is the opening he's been waiting for all along. This is Joe's entire game plan. The next round begins, and Nanbu also catches on to what Joe is trying to do. He plans on eating Aragaki's punches as much as possible, and wait for the right time to strike back perfectly. He can go with this strategy because his durability is top-notch. He's taken on many people from the underground with practically a scrap metal gear. In this round, Aragaki begins to slow down. Hence, Joe begins to strike back more often. This round ends with the tide in favor of Joe. However, before the next round could begin, Aragaki simply forfeits. He is then taken back to his room by his coach because he simply can't walk anymore. The coach tells him it's nothing to be ashamed of. That was a fine final fight to his career. Nanbu goes to meet Aragaki in his locker room, and he confesses that the doctors even told him that he might never be able to walk again if he took this fight. He finally confesses that he didn't know what to feel, and just wanted a kind of closure that only a fight with Joe could give him. In the end, he says that he no longer holds any resentment. Aragaki then says that he believes that Joe will join the Megalomania. After becoming the new 17th ranked fighter, Gearless Joe becomes the new talk of the town. Not only did he ram through every contender all the way from last place, he did so without a gear. That's the reason he had people making graffiti of him all around town. Girls began to have tattoos of Joe's face on their bodies. The International Megalomania Association is now about to hold a battle between Shirato Mikio and Sugar R. Hill. The commentators are saying that this will be the fight to decide the final person who goes into Megalomania. However, this would mean that Gearless Joe would have to be left behind. Both commentators agree that he's indeed a rising star, but doesn't justify his position in Megalomania just yet. They also both agree that any one of Mikio and Sugar can easily put Joe's lights out for good. Nanbu is watching this channel and sees Yukiko pass by him. He intentionally states out loud that the fight between Mikio and Sugar can't decide the final person that goes into Megalomania, because it would mean that a prospect like Gearless Joe would be ignored. This statement catches Yukiko's attention, and she begins talking to Nanbu. She says that everyone is welcome in Megalomania, but then comes close and whispers in his ear, except those who are gearless. After saying that, she continues her walk away from Nanbu along with all her other associates. The fight between Shirato, Mikio, and Sugar starts after a while. Nanbu tells Sachio that the gear of Mikio is AI enhanced, and that is what makes it so lethal. The gear can read the opponent and tell him the perfect countermeasure. It doesn't take long for Mikio to knock Sugar out and claim an overwhelming victory. After the KO, he calls out Joe on the open stage. Meanwhile, Joe is locked in his room. In fact, his leg is chained to prevent him from going anywhere. Nanbu comes over and tells him that they have done it. His bout date with Mikio will be decided soon, and if Joe wins this fight, it's a ticket straight to Megalomania. Meanwhile, Yukiko, the owner of the International Megalomania Association, pays a visit to Mikio. Mikio is her brother, and his gear is made by the same company as Yuri's, the Shirato company. Mikio tells Yukiko that there will be no stopping him. He will soon defeat that champion Yuri once and for all to demonstrate to the whole world that his AI gear is the top model out there and not the integrated one Yuri uses. Mikio also accuses Yukiko of setting him up against Sugar, so he could lose the fight. According to Mikio, his fight against Joe was also inevitable, because Yukiko wants nothing more than to stop Mikio. However, Yukiko is convinced that Yuri is more than enough for the job, and there is nothing to worry about for her. The fight between Mikio and Joe is set. However, just before it could start, Mikio meets with Joe and his coach in private. He tells them that he knows everything about Joe, including the fact that he's a fake citizen. Mikio blackmails Joe and his team. He asks them to forfeit the fight if they don't want their secret to be revealed. However, the only thing those words do is just piss off Joe, who charges at him. Nanbu appears out of nowhere and launches a punch straight at Joe's stomach. He had read the situation very cautiously and concluded that it's best to forfeit the fight. Joe's team announces that they will withdraw from the fight, and the final spot in Megalomania is snatched by Mikio in the dirtiest way possible. After forfeiting the match, Joe is seen punching a bag to take out all his frustration. It was the frustration of a man who had done everything to get to the top. But he fell just before reaching the tip of the mountain. The commentators on TV announce Mikio to be the final contender who makes his spot in the Megalomania. Nanbu goes and has a talk with Fujimaki, who is immensely disappointed that they forfeited. Nanbu must explain to him that Mikio knew about the counterfeit ID of Joe, and that he wasn't really a citizen. If the secret got out, that would mean Joe's boxing days would be over for good. The scene cuts to when Nanbu was talking to Joe and Sachio about why they had to forfeit. Joe is still angry at him for being stopped by a punch. He reminds Nanbu how they came a long way and forfeiting wasn't the right thing. However, Nanbu counters by saying that there is a reason Mikio blackmailed them instead of simply going public about it. Nanbu says that Mikio wanted more than anything to ragebait Joe into fighting him before the match. That would instantly disqualify Joe. The scene cuts back to Nanbu talking to Fujimaki. After getting to know that Joe's secret had been exposed, Fujimaki is still confident that there is no way they have any evidence on Joe not being a citizen. Their work for Joe was quite professional, and there isn't a snowball chance in hell anyone can possibly prove that Joe is not a valid citizen with a valid ID. In other words, Fujimaki calls out Nanbu for being an absolute fool. It's true that Mikio may have figured out the truth, but there's no way he could prove it. That's why he resorted to blackmailing instead of going to the officials about it. Nanbu immediately realizes his huge error and regrets forfeiting the match. The first thing Nanbu does after realizing his blunder is talk to an engineer who once worked for Shirato. Fujimaki is also there with him, and that engineer spills the beans. Shirato may seem like a united front, but the reality is quite different. There was one gear that was being developed using AI, and that's the one Mikio uses, whereas the other project the company was working on is the one Yuri currently uses, the integrated model. Eventually the integrated model came out too, but Mikio wouldn't accept this defeat, and he continued to evolve his AI model even more. The engineer also tells them that the AI gear uses sensors to track the pattern of the opponent's gear, making it very hard to beat. This statement rang a bell inside Nanbu's brain. He understands now why Mikio went to such heights just to prevent the fight with Joe. It's because his gear can't read Joe since Joe doesn't even use a gear. Sachio breaks this news to Joe and tells him that Mikio is just afraid of Joe. If they can get a match with him again somehow, their victory is guaranteed. Nanbu gets into a private meeting with Yukiko, the owner of Megalomania, and tells her exactly what happened. He even gives a long speech trying to convince her to make the bout between Joe and Mikio happen again. However, all his persuasion amounts to nothing as Yukiko says the ceremony to welcome Mikio into megalomania is going to happen tonight. Saying that, she leaves Nambu and goes straight to the ceremony to make everything official. In a final twist of events, just as Yukiko is about to give Mikio the invitation to megalomania, Joe barges in with his bike and announces openly in front of everyone that he wishes to fight Mikio. Initially, Yukiko maintains her reluctance and refusal to engage with him, but eventually gives in. In a dramatic turn of events, she announces that the fight is indeed going to happen, since it's the fight that the people want more than anything. Mikio takes the announcement as a sign that Yukiko simply wishes to destroy her project, and he vows to do his best to destroy her. The highly anticipated match between Joe and Mikio finally arrives, and the start of the match goes just like any other match of Joe would. He is severely outgunned and on the defense. This gives a confidence boost to the young Mikio, who wonders if Joe is simply regretting stepping into the ring with him. He brings Joe to the ground multiple times, but each time Joe gets back up. At this point, it's safe to say that the gear can read the movements of a normal human too. This was a newer one specifically designed to take down Yuri once and for all. By the end of the second round, Mikio goes even as far as to trip Joe over with his legs. This enrages the young Joe, and he charges at him even though the round has ended. Nanbu and Sachio grab a hold of him to remind him not to do anything foolish. Nanbu at Joe's corner tells him that this fight is as hard as it gets. Not only is the AI in Mikio's gear telling him what to do, it's also reading Joe's every trick and footwork the moment Joe reveals them. It instantly cooks up a proper countermeasure without much delay at all. This is Joe's most frustrating fight yet. Meanwhile, on Mikio's end, he wonders about how he'll win this gear and prove to everyone that Shirato made a mistake by choosing their integrated model to be the flagship representative of the company. He's gone to many heights and genuinely believes in this technology deep in his heart. The scene cuts to one of the training scenes of Mikio. He pushes his synchronization with the AI of his gear to its limit. It even takes a toll on his body and mind. Yet he continues to do so by taking shots of adrenaline. Yukiko believes that a gear that takes such a huge toll on the human and takes the boxing away from them is practically useless in the real world. It'll have no demand practically, and Mikio simply refuses to see this, blinded by his ambition to prove himself as the rightful owner of the company. The fight continues, and as one would expect, Mikio continues to dominate every moment of it. Joe is a tough puppy. Even as he's getting beaten to a pulp, he musters up the strength to tell Mikio that he's not the real deal. The taunt gets to his nerves, and he punches Joe so hard that he literally lands outside the ring. Mikio remembers one of his encounters with Yuri at the company. He was in anguish and asks him why he prefers the integrated gear over his AI-enhanced gear. Yuri has a simple reply. He told him that he only wants to win. That is the only reason he took the integrated gear over the AI-enhanced one. Mikio didn't accept this as a valid reason and began to instigate the situation. Yuri almost punches Mikio and tells him that the true reason was his desire to make his own decisions in the ring. And making his choices for him is not something a boxer could possibly allow. In the present, Joe gets back up and faces Mikio once again. This time, he does something really out of the blue. He begins to walk towards Mikio without holding his hands up, leaving him wide open to a punch that might send him straight to the heavens. This felt like a taunt to Mikio, and he gets ready to launch the biggest punch of his career fueled with rage. But then he suddenly stops. The AI of the gear is convinced that Joe is up to something new, and doesn't let him respond hastily. Instead of a power shot, Mikio finds himself throwing left jabs that are easily being absorbed by Joe. The round eventually ends, and the whole crowd is left wondering what on earth happened to Mikio. The next round starts, and Joe continues with his stance, keeping his arms down. The AI finally decides to make a KO move. It's a right feint paired with a left hook that is meant to drop Joe for good. Joe reacts in the nick of time with a counter that lands perfectly. He can't dodge Mikio's attack entirely, but his punch connected well enough to drop Mikio for good, leaving him standing. Mikio can't get up, and Gearless Joe claims yet again another victory to his name. Later that night, everyone celebrates Joe's greatest victory to date, and how he has no choice but to not join the party since he must recover by resting. However, there is a secret that Nanbu is keeping that he hasn't told anyone yet. The scene cuts back to the present where Nanbu is trying his best to convince Joe to throw his next fight. But Joe is not buying it. He feels a kind of betrayal he's never felt before in his life. Joe utters the words, You never believed in me, did you? Nanbu counters by saying that this couldn't be further from the truth. He genuinely believes that Joe is a first-grade fighter who would reach megalomania. However, for now, they must rig this next fight, because that's always been the deal with Fujimaki. They can always try to win megalomania later since Joe will always be a great boxer. However, all the speech fell on deaf ears. Nothing Nanbu could say could possibly make it up to Joe for the false hope he had been given and the sweet dreams he had been sold. Both were a complete lie from the very start. The thing about betrayal is that it always comes from a friend. Joe simply rides his bike away from the scene. Fujimaki then walks close to Nanbu, uttering the words, "The thing about sweet dreams is that you have to eventually wake up." Joe simply rides away and screams in pure agony and despair. Sachio also feels betrayed, having heard the entire conversation. No one knows where Joe has driven off to, but Nanbu then catches up to Sachio and has a conversation with him. Sachio is mad at him for using Joe and initially refuses to engage in any sort of conversation. Then Nanbu replies by saying that he's been doing the same thing. Sachio gets surprised at the words that came out of Nanbu's mouth. Nanbu then says that he knows about Sachio's past. His father was an engineer working for the Shirato company. Things went sideways and all his father's research was stolen by the company, leaving him eventually dead. His mother also died a year later, making him a complete orphan. Nanbu takes the kid to Yukiko's home. He tells the kid if he really blames the corporation for the death of his father, he should avenge his family. Nanbu gives him a knife, and Sachio senses a fury of rage builds up inside him when he looks at Yukiko from a distance. However, he then sees Yukiko treating children with kindness and realizes that she's just another human. He says that the only revenge that he wants is for Joe to reach the finals. Nanbu then decides to go to Yukiko's home and asks her to take care of this kid, because he is the son of the engineer who created the integrated gear that Yuri uses. Yukiko, being a kind person, accepts this, and after confirming that Sachio's father really was the man behind the integrated gear, she takes care of him. Meanwhile, Fujimaki asks if Joe has changed in him. Nanbu knows that no one can tell what Joe would really do until the day of the fight. For now, he must just tell Fujimaki that Joe was just in need a little convincing and now he's totally on the same page as them. Eventually, the first megalomania match happens, and it's the one between Yuri and the Spider. They both fight valiantly, and Spider was the one who lands the first hit. However, that only made the lust for victory inside Yuri rise even more. Not long after, in the second round, Yuri lands a clear hook that puts the Spider to sleep. It's another easy win for him, and Joe is there to witness it in person. After the fight, Yuri and Joe happen to meet each other. Joe congratulates him on his victory and tells him the hook was an amazing one. Yuri asks him why Joe insists on fighting gearless. He confesses that it was initially to get his name out there, but eventually, he finds a passion for fighting with nothing but his own 2 fists. He then asks Yuri what it is that he fights for. He replies that Yukiko believed in him when no one did, so it's his responsibility to make sure her dream comes true, and the future of the company is secure with the integrated gear. Hearing this internally pisses Joe off a bit since he was just betrayed by the only person he thought believed in him. In the next episode, Mr. Nanbu is sitting alone in his truck wondering about the life choices that he has made. He genuinely feels bad about Joe as well. He can only imagine what Joe is going through right now. As he wonders these things, he's also listening to the radio. The commentators and megalo boxing critics are anticipating Joe's next fight against the Bloodlion Burroughs. Ironically, everyone, including the most acclaimed critics, are convinced that Joe has the advantage in the upcoming fight. For the first time ever, Joe's skills are being acknowledged worldwide, and they've actually decided to throw this fight. Nanbu gets in a call with Fujimaki. He tells Fujimaki that security wasn't really required for his protection. Actually, there is a car behind Nanbu's truck with Fujimaki's men in them. Fujimaki says that it's required and he can't possibly risk it at all. All his gambling customers are betting on Joe. Making Joe lose his fight in the megalomania is going to be a breakthrough for him as well. Meanwhile, Sachio is enjoying his life comfortably in the mansion since Yukiko agreed to give him protection in return for his father's services. He has a little talk with Yukiko, who tells him that it's almost time for Joe's fight, so why isn't he going to the arena? He gets a little emotional and says that he doesn't need to be there to know how it ends. Sachio thinks Joe will definitely win his fight against Burroughs the Bloody Lion. In reality, he's afraid Joe will inevitably decide to throw the fight, and that's a sight that he just can't witness. Then finally, the time arrives for the fight. The announcer introduces the fighters in the most dramatic fashion, and the Bloody Lion comes with his allies ready for war. On the other hand, Joe is introduced just as well. The gearless, naked boy, Joe. However, he walks out alone with nobody with him. But there is another thing that shakes the audience. For the first time ever, he is wearing his gear. The gearless Joe is gearless no more. The commentators are anticipating that this guy chose to rely on his gear because of the sheer difference in the power output between the bloody lion and himself. However, Nambu and everyone involved in the fixing of the fight understood what it meant. Joe wearing a gear was more of a metaphor for the fact that he's a dog with a leash. It's his way of saying that he will throw the fight, and even has the earpiece attached in his ears so Nambu could tell him exactly what to do to make it look like an authentic loss. Nambu tells him that to make it look like it's an authentic fight, he'll have to lose in the third round. It'll also give Fujimaki's gambling customers a final chance to place their bets on Joe in the very last minute. After all, Joe is the fighting favorite here to begin with. The fight begins, and Joe is giving the bloody lion a run for his money. The bloody lion does have the edge. But it seems like after the first round, Joe wasn't going to hand him the win easily. Fujimaki's henchmen begin to question Joe's loyalty. They think that he might be trying to win, but Nanbu replies that Joe would have landed more punches, and the uppercut he missed would have connected had he really been trying to win in the first place. Fujimaki sees and understands everything. Joe is going ahead with the plan, but there is a wild beast inside him that's forging an impulse for him to win. It's like he's a wild hound who won't listen to everything Nanbu tells him, even if he has decided to go with his owner's plan in the grand scheme of things. The second round starts, and since this is also a round that they must survive through, Nanbu gets ahead of himself and starts telling Joe some advice that could actually hand him the victory. He gets pumped up when Joe gets the upper hand. By this time, Joe's gear also gets broken, and everyone is wondering how it doesn't give him any advantage to begin with. The second round ends. Fujimaki tells Nanbu that he's changed quite a lot. Instead of being a lowly scorpion, he's beginning to act more like a coach. The third round starts, and now Nanbu must go on the back step. Instead of telling Joe fight strategies, he starts trying to convince Joe to throw the fight. He tells Joe that this is the last time he'll have to do this, and they can always fight in Megalomania again. However, after hearing this, Fujimaki interrupts them. He says that Joe will always be his dog, and Nanbu will always be his scorpion. Just because his debt will be repaid doesn't mean he'll let go of the leash that's holding them. After hearing this, when Joe gets knocked down, instead of telling him to stay down, Nanbu tells him to get up. Nanbu realizes that for the first time, he must take a stand against Fujimaki. That's the only way to ensure his future doesn't get dismantled. However, Joe is knocked down for good, and just as it seems like he's never going to get up, Yuri comes over and tells him to get up. Yuri wants to fight Joe in the final match, and he doesn't want to be disappointed by him. This sparks the passion inside Joe that was missing. He begins to get up like a phoenix rising from its ashes. His gear, or rather what was left of it, crumbles and comes off of him. His rising felt like the final rise of the gearless Joe from the ashes of his past pathetic self. Joe takes the bloody lion head-on and eventually lands a counter that stuns the entire crowd. He wins the match with a staggering KO. The crowd expected nothing less from gearless Joe. Joe goes straight to the private VIP section where Fujimaki and Nanbu are sitting. He finds Nanbu without his eyes. One was already missing, and Fujimaki took the other as well for his betrayal. Joe gets angry and is ready to beat Fujimaki to a pulp, but Nanbu stops him. Nanbu states that if his vision was not enough to soothe the betrayal he had caused Fujimaki, he'd gladly lay his heart on the table for him. Fujimaki just tells his henchmen to take Joe, Nanbu and Sachio away from his sight. Even though he had just lost a lot of money, he wonders about the irony of the situation. Nanbu wanted nothing more than to see Joe shine in Megalomania, yet he ends up sacrificing his vision once and for all just so Joe could thrive. Fujimaki was satisfied with his revenge and found the situation ironically amusing as well. Meanwhile, Yuri is pumped after getting to know that his final match is against Joe. He can't wait to finally get his hands on him. The next episode starts with Yukiko signing a contract with the military since the tournament had already showcased the potential of the integrated gear. Yukiko always wanted to use the Megalomania tournament to show the whole world just exactly how reliable the integrated gear can be when it comes to physical endurance. It's not something that's meant to be used just for megaloboxing, and she had succeeded even before Yuri got a chance to fight the final match. Now the whole world is aware of the limitless application of the integrated gear system, and the Shirato company is going to be swarmed with a ton of contracts from several different organizations. After signing the first contract, Yuri meets up with Yukiko in private to congratulate her. After a little bit of small talk, He tells her that he wants the gear to be removed for good. He wants to take on Gearless Joe on equal terms. To do that, he's going to have to take his gear off. Yukiko tells Yuri that's not going to be possible. First of all, the integrated gear is a part of Yuri now. There is no guarantee that the surgical removal is going to be successful to begin with. Secondly, she also wishes to further prove to everyone how reliable it can be. Even though it's proved itself quite a lot, she still wants Yuri to wear it while fighting the final of Megalomania. Yuri simply tells her that he's made up his mind, and there is nothing she can do to convince him otherwise. Saying that, he leaves Yukiko's office, leaving her with a turmoil she's never felt before. The agony of being rejected and powerless rams Yukiko for the first time in her life, and she punches her desk in frustration. Meanwhile, Joe is as hyped up as a boxer can possibly get for his final match against Yuri. He's been punching the bag non-stop since morning, and Sachio tells him that he needs to take a break. However, Joe is in no mood for a break, and keeps at it. Nanbu then comes in to interrupt, and brings along Aragaki and Miyagi with him. Nanbu tells him that Joe needs a sparring partner, as punching bags can't really hit back. Aragaki asks Joe if it'll be okay with him, and Joe says that he'll provide more challenge than a static punching bag, that's for sure. They both get in the ring, and Joe tells him that he regrets not being able to knock out Aragaki, and Aragaki replies that the feeling is mutual. Before things could heat up any further, Miyagi reminds the two of them that this is a sparring match, and there is no need to overdo it as it could injure Joe for his final match. They both continue with their sparring match, and eventually, Nanbu stops them, saying that Joe's punches are losing effectiveness because he isn't performing them with the perfect technique. Sachio asks him how on earth can he say that if he doesn't even have eyes. Nanbu counters by saying that he can hear Joe's punches just fine, so if he thinks he can slack off just because Nanbu has lost his vision, he's dead wrong. Joe then begins to be more cautious with his punches, which pleases Nanbu. On the other hand, we have Yuri, who goes to meet up with Mikio. After losing his fight to Joe, Mikio leaves Shirato for good, and now lives alone in the woods. Since no one in Shirato was going to comply with Yuri's request for his integrated gear removal, he had to request Mikio. They both head to the basement where Mikio tells Yuri that he'll be operating on him over here. Mikio warns him beforehand that the success of the surgery is not guaranteed and it can go wrong. However, that's a price Yuri is easily willing to pay, and they proceed with the surgery. Meanwhile, Yukiko is left alone wondering. She goes back to the place Joe first met Yuri, back when Joe nearly collided with Yukiko. She wonders about the effect that had been set in motion after that encounter. Had it never happened, maybe Gearless Joe would have never been born. Yuri ignited something inside Joe that night, something that only a genuine boxer can understand. She then visits Mikio, but it's already too late. The surgery has already been performed on Yuri. He's laying there unconscious in front of both Yukiko and Mikio. Mikio tells Yukiko that she wanted to show the world what the integrated gear technology can do, and tells her that Yuri has already accomplished that for her. Why not let him fight for himself for once? Yukiko disagrees. How can the final match be between two people who don't even use gears? It wouldn't be megalo-boxing to begin with. Yukiko even goes as far as to research about Gearless Joe. She realizes that he's a fake citizen who has no right to be taking part in sanctioned bouts. She is internally conflicted. She doesn't want this gearless fight to happen, but on the other hand, Yuri means quite a lot to her. She doesn't want to make him upset either. Eventually, Yukiko simply decides to visit Joe and return his citizen ID that Sachio left in her home. Joe figured out that she probably knows by now that he's not a citizen and is fighting in the megalomania illegally. However, she isn't there to tell him that. In fact, despite knowing about Joe's secret, she tells him the final will happen as scheduled. She also tells Joe that Yuri has taken off the integrated gear. The final fight will be a gearless brawl between these two. This gets Joe hyped up even more. In the final episode, the most awaited match is finally here. The spectators can't believe what they're witnessing. Both Joe and Yuri are standing there with no gear. No one could have possibly speculated things to pan out like this. An underdog stray fighting against the world champion, with both of them being gearless. Before the fight starts, Joe asks Yuri what it feels like to be gearless. He replies that he can finally taste the thrill of getting in the ring that Joe always gets. With a smirk on their faces, they both begin the fight. Sachio notices the huge scars on Yuri's body in places where he had the integrated gear on. It was obvious that he was suffering from post-operative pain during the match. Yet he was doing very well against Joe. A few rounds pass by, and both are trading blows on almost equal footing. The commentators analyze that Joe is the one who's more aggressive, but Yuri is landing strikes that are more precise and landing on their intended points. After a few rounds, Yuri shows his amazing trick that allows him to switch between southpaw and normal orthodox stance. It's hard for Joe to read it properly, and Yuri begins to take the lead in exchanging blows. After the round ends, Nanbu tells Joe that there is no doubt that Yuri has the edge in both offense and defense. However, if he keeps his training in mind, there is always going to be a chance to capitalize on. He just must stay cautious. In between rounds, Yuri isn't even sitting. The commentators think that it's just one more proof that Yuri has the better stamina out of the two. However, Mikio is watching their fight as well. He thinks the exact opposite is true. Yuri is still fatigued from the post-operative surgery. There is no way he's recovered completely by this time. He's refusing to sit because if he does, there's no getting up. Both warriors fought valiantly and reached up to the 13th round. Joe got knocked multiple times and so did Yuri, but each time they both got up. Nanbu even gave him a pep talk in between rounds. In the end, the fight concluded with both exchanging a final blow. Thinking this was the best moment of their lives, the fight ends, and the victor of the battle is not revealed. In the end, the Megalomania tournament didn't happen again for the next year because Yukiko got what she wanted, and that was contracts for her integrated gear. Joe began to live his life as a common man, and Yuri became a good friend of his. However, Yuri also lost both of his legs because of the integrated gear removal surgery. Nanbu ends up starting a garden because he feels like it'll be fulfilling for him. In the end, every character leads a simple but happy life after the final of Megalomania.